Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 32. We're recording it on Friday, November 4th, 2020 at 1:20 p.m. Eastern time. And, we just recorded the last episode. We like to do these, more than one at a time. And we're just going to continue where we left off on this discussion. Like God is everything, meaning that God is both good and evil. We need to understand that so we don't blame ourselves. And so we understand that we can love God just like we love our parents, understanding that just as our parents aren't perfectly good, God isn't perfectly good. So this is I think what we're trying to say is that, wait a minute. Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I think something amazing we came up on in the last episode was this concept that a view of God that's actually biblical, because God says in the Bible that God creates evil as well as good. So a view of God that God creates evil, right, is actually a more loving version of God than the view that we're more used to hearing in the West of being sold this story of God is great and all loving and only good and doesn't do any bad and isn't responsible, you know. And so I think it's just an amazing, shift of consciousness that, we don't see many religions, you have to wonder why they ignored this part of the Bible, right? Was it purely just because it was easier to sell a more rosy version of God and kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes? But in fact, how can if God is responsible for your failings and your suffering, then he's obviously a more loving God than if he's blaming you.
Yeah, and in the Bible, it's not just that there are numerous instances of God doing, things that don't seem that good, destroying entire cities, telling people like, kill every man, woman, and child there, don't spare anyone. But it's not just that. It's God in Isaiah. God directly, explicitly says to Isaiah, I create good, I create evil. So you can't get any more clear. The problem is, yes, you know, in our stage in evolution is a species, a society, it's global civilization. We haven't reached that point. This series, I don't know how many people throughout the world are preaching this gospel of like God is everything. God is, yes, good. God is also evil. But this seems to be the stage we're at to properly understand God.
Yeah, George, like I'm thinking about some memes that I've seen recently online. Like, imagine if you and I were going to start a new church or new religion, and we were going to make this story where we said we're going to drown everybody on Earth. Everybody on Earth we're going to drown, and kill, right? And if that's going to be a children's story, and we're going to publish that and sell that book as a children's story in our church, and how long would it how offended would people be before they realized, oh, that's the story of Noah's flood, and that is a children's story that we give to everybody of mass genocide, to children. And it's like this double standard for religions, and that they get away with this version of a God that's anti-human. And I think it's causes a lot of trauma and fear when we're little children exposed to these messages that we grow up with, and causes a lot of our problems.
Here's some cause for major hope, and then we actually may be a major part of this. Until the internet, 30 years ago or whatever, when it started, these things, and actually before that there was print and TV and radio, but before that, before books, it took centuries and centuries and centuries for ideas to evolve, to spread throughout the world, and for people to understand them all. Now, somebody gets an idea about, correct some misapprehension about something, whether it's in science, religion, whatever. The next day, it could be throughout the entire world. So, I mean, that's very hopeful that now we're in an era where we can finally address these misconceptions of God and have very strong reason to hope that we can make major changes with this.
Yeah, George, and uh, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's a bittersweet. I think it's good, but you also see that hardly any new religions have started because previously all you had to do is talk convincing and people believed you. But now your message is being spread around the world and the whole world is basically auditing what you're saying and putting out all your errors, right? And same thing for science, and this is why science moves so slowly. Um, and so I think there's something that's going to have to take place to salvage the institution of religion or spirituality where we have more grace. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's just so clear that gurus and false prophets um, can't get away with what they got away with. um, that's just some thoughts
Right,
that I think
and
about.
and like if they are teaching traditional religion, that's so much about free will, yeah, it makes sense that their message doesn't reach people the way it could or should because it's an inaccurate message. But if people like us and scientists who are coming up with not so much within religion but various scientific truths, if we present more accurate representations of reality, what I'm saying is we have the infrastructure, we have the vehicle within the internet to get it out there. And people may try to knock, for example, like an omnipotent God. You can't knock that down. You can try to create arguments, but as we showed in episodes 3 through 7, if you define God the way God is defined in the Bible, God has to be omnipotent. So, I think we can make major progress through the internet.
Yeah, George, you mentioned the illusion of free will and last episode, and we started this episode talking about this concept where God is omnipotent, all powerful. That means God is creating evil and suffering. If you define God the way God is defined in the Bible, and I think that goes hand in hand with this illusion of free will message, and it's probably the most important message that we could get out because you know imagine, like we talked about last episode, with dark energy, dark matter, quantum physics, any of these issues that no scientist disagrees, and they're all, if you disagreed with any of these, they would just strike you down immediately. But we haven't got there yet with this illusion of free will. So many of the scientists and most of the religions are still, have cognitive dissonance and are living, preaching a falsehood about this.
Yeah, and we were talking before about, well, these religions have been around for several thousand years, and they apparently haven't achieved what they've intended at least to the extent. I think the world has gotten a lot better in a lot of ways, and that may be the reason. In other words, if you start out with an inaccurate, harmful, extremely harmful conception of God, saying, that God gave us a free will and it's all our fault and we can really do whatever we want and God is not omnipotent, then if your fundamental understanding of God is wrong, and religion is, at least monotheistic religion is centered around God, then that probably explains why over the last several thousand years we haven't evolved nearly as much as we would have and could have if we had began with this more accurate understanding.
Yeah. Um, so I'm just feeling like I want to try to unify these two concepts, how they go hand in hand, and this view of uh, this idea of God that is a more loving view of God takes the responsibility for evil in the world, takes the responsibility for, suffering, because God is all powerful, um, and how that goes hand in hand to really embrace that more loving view of God, where we're not blaming ourselves and each other, and thus able to see causality and actually fix the problems basically in sin, that has to go hand in hand with an understanding of this illusion of free will, because you know as long as you're viewing one, you're missing one, you're not going to get the other, and vice versa. And so maybe we can think of some more ways to do that, to unify how this view of God as evil and responsible for evil, at least, goes hand in hand with this illusion of free will.
Yeah, I'm going to make kind of like a proclamation in a sense. Like, I think that, like, the first major advance in our acknowledgement and understanding of God came, I think, with Abraham. Well, I mean, you could go to polytheism and then, with just the gods and all, but like a monotheistic God, the first, major step came with Abraham recognizing this one God. Okay. And like, then between then and now, Moses set out laws, but laws, I mean, they had laws. They had, Hammurabi had laws, so I think the next major step in religion is to properly understand God in a way that neither Judaism nor Christianity nor Islam, the monotheistic religions have yet achieved. Perhaps once we achieve that as a world, we can make major progress.
Yeah, George. And I think this evolutionary perspective, this evolution of consciousness and religion and God is so important because it allows people to overcome the cognitive dissonance of, well, why is it wrong? Why are we living in a falsehood today? Because, it makes it more palatable. And so for me, it's an understanding that, again, this concept of self that I also refer to as an illusion of how we consider it today, right? If we track it all the way back in early religion and even earlier than that, we realize the function of the self was to try to be consistent, right? That's essentially what a large part of the ego was. We're biological creatures. We're living in starvation, basically, and we're going around just eating whatever we can find. It's changing our biochemistry radically from day to day. And we're, and so there's all these mechanisms to try to get us to be consistent so we can identify, oh, that's a friend and he's going to behave this way, or that's an enemy because he's going to behave that way. And that's largely how it evolved.
Right. And so again, I want to pull this back to God. So like, we're not treating each other and ourselves the way we should. And when, again, for several thousand years, either with the wrong conception of God or way too often, even within religion. So much of religion, again, is not about God. It's about religious people. It's about the Christians and the early Jews, the Hebrews and stuff. And so like, to the extent that we shift, that we recognize that, the first task of a monotheistic religion is to accurately and comprehensively and deeply understand God. That may be what we've been lacking, and finally, maybe we're finally getting it. Maybe that's what's happening now.
Yeah. So kind of continuing on that thread and tying them together, so I think the monotheistic religions, especially, they were looking for ways, definitions, ideas of God that allowed or caused people to be more consistent and be able to control their behavior, um, more than just the ego or the self-concept or identity could. And so what they did is they introduced shame. Basically, it evolved from monkeys or animals that could just, early humans that just had to resort to violence, to being able to be in more groups and basically early religious tribes, by having this technology of shame to basically shame you and make you feel social ostracization, right? And so this view of God as judging you if you fail, and if you don't follow the rules of the tribe, you're going to get kicked out or made fun of or whatever.
All right, I think we're trying to fix the world, and it makes sense because that really is the overall goal of better, more accurately understanding God. But I'm suspecting that we need to just like that we're not there yet. That that until we have this really, really strong, comprehensive, accurate understanding of God, that all the social engineering, all the kinds of plans that we have that don't include an understanding of God, may be just severely limited in what we can expect. So let's try to pull this more to kind of like, understanding of, for example, God as eternal. What does that mean to you, that God is eternal, that God has existed, eternally?
Um, Again, that's another one that I struggle with really connecting to, you know, uh, and other than being the creator of everything, I guess, and maybe knowing the future, but this, I like the timelessness of it and looking at the micro time. And so, if God's eternal, God's in this moment. So, all conceptions of God in the past can somehow serve me making the best decisions in this moment, or connecting to resources that my ancestors developed, forms of consciousness my ancestors developed by how they understood God and worshiped God, or just existed, right? And so how do I tap into those instead of just blaming myself for being a failure, or blaming myself for, or just being a self-fulfilling prophecy that I'm just going to keep making the same mistakes.
Right. All right. So like, God is not just eternal. God is omniscient, meaning that God knows everything that's going to happen in the future. And in the eternal past, he knew everything that's happening in the present. Not, and he knows it completely, or she, I prefer to use she, because like we've used he way too much, I think. So like, to the extent, so like, it's not just that God is present in this present reality. God is present in every reality. God, in other words, like the Middle Ages continue to exist, gazillion years ago continues to exist. A gazillion years from now already exists. So we have to wrap our heads around this fundamental, and physics backs this up. The times are relative and all. So this is what I mean by understanding like God and God's essential nature.
Hmm. Yeah, it's hard to, again, I still struggle to connect with it. So it feels like I'm missing something that I need to get. Um, so I'll talk it out a little bit more. One part of it is this kind of hope, I guess. Religions and ideas of God talk about faith, right? And so again, this eternal perspective is essentially, whatever exists in the future, well, God's more in control of it than I am. So, you know, I can kind of relax a little bit, I guess, and not worry about things so much. Try not to worry about things so much. And, and previously in history, again, we're all the product of, millions of years of hundreds and thousands of successfully lived lives, right, that came before us. So that's
Yeah,
some thoughts.
I think I may understand what you seem to be missing. In other words, like you're trying to connect, when we're exploring God, you're trying to connect it with us. I mean, your overall goal, which is, it's my goal also, is to better the world, to end suffering, to create like a paradise on earth, right? So like when we talk about God being eternal, you're kind of like wondering, what, how does that relate? How does knowing that relate to any problem we have here on earth? Yes, but we're kind of like conducting what in science is known as fundamental research, or I forget there's another word for it, but just the basic research, that they do research not to understand the practical applications of what they're trying to understand, but simply to understand more. And then once they have sufficient understanding, so this is what we're trying to do with God. We don't necessarily have to connect this knowledge to any practical use yet.
Yeah, I think one part of it is like these uh, two views, purposes for religion, or understanding God. And it's how traditional religion is actually laid out. So these worship experiences where you go in and you worship together by singing music, or whatever it is, the ritual, the ceremony, or the sacrament, and you try to have a very expansive, connected oneness, unity view or sense of consciousness, right? And that's very let go of reality, or let go of all the mundane technical details, right? And then this other part of religion is the laws, the rules, the best practices, right? And so maybe this belongs more in the oneness, unity, um, and hope kind of camp and experience. And that's we can all kind of have that any time of the day if we just stop and take a minute to check in with it, maybe.
I think you nailed it. I think basically it's just, you're right. It's like we're trapped in this ego of like, being, having a personal identity, personal self. And like just these rituals you're referring to, they pull us out of the ego. But where do they pull us into? They pull us into God. So like, to the extent that we're exploring God, that we're focusing on God, that we're kind of like forgetting about ourselves, forgetting even that we exist. We're trying to understand God as comprehensively, as completely as we can. We're trying to focus on God as much as we can. To the extent we do that, then yes, that may be a process of vanquishing the ego, of just like, separating ourselves from this ego that, if we look sociologically and all, does cause so many problems. So that may be a practical, application of better understanding God.
Yeah, I'm reminded of this sense of awe that many writers talk about, and I think even psychology is trying to wrap its hands around how to make use of this, right? The sense of awe, and so many of these attributes of God fit under that sense of awe. And it's very much an experience, as it's being defined by writers and scientists now. It is a state of consciousness. It's actually like an altered state of consciousness. So, a lot, probably all of us have experienced it. Maybe we didn't have a name for it, or, had a different name for it. But, we've experienced it in the movie theater, or when we're out in nature, or at, in front of an amazing sunset or something. It's this sense of awe that's, something much greater than us. And I think that's maybe something we don't cultivate enough in our society, or we don't, talk about enough, or it's a technology that we could tap into to make life better.
Right. And again, something much greater than us. Like, let's just now ponder this aspect of God that we talked about, I think last episode, there being an infinite number of worlds in this infinite reality that we call God. And so like, God is omnipotent, so that God knows everything that's going on in every one of these worlds, not just in the present, but God knows what happened in every one of these infinite worlds in the past and what's going to happen in the future. It's mind blowing. And it's it. And again, like then if we bring the omnipotent aspect of God into this, it's not just that God knows what's happening in every one of these worlds, but God is making it all happen. It's God's will being manifest in every single one of these infinite worlds.
Yeah, and I think that's just such an important thing to be able to connect to. I mean, even in our little world, even our little corner of the world, we often feel so powerless and so hopeless with, whatever the political drama that's playing out, or the pandemic, or the economic turmoil. And, when I think about all those things, my mind tends to think about like specific things that, was said during the political campaign, or, specific limitations of the pandemic, right? Or specific financial burdens or needs. But maybe maybe I can subvert the egoic monkey mind chatter by going to this, either dwelling on these attributes of God, or, using the example you did of, the infinite number of universes, right? And kind of focusing on that to get this sense of hope.
Exactly. I think, somebody wrote a book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and It's All Small Stuff, or this idea of seeing the big picture. When we see the big picture, that, even what's happening in this entire era, these last 100 years, whatever, it's just like, it's a blip. It's a tiny little blip in time and space and all. So when we focus on God as everything, as eternal and infinite, and then we being a part of God, it's not like we die and we cease to exist. We've done episodes on this. We continue to exist in God's memory. We existed eternally in God's I don't know if it's presentience or prescience. I mean, just knowing something in advance. Um, but we have this eternity again. To have this understanding of God just makes all this stuff so much easier to bear, whatever it is.
Yeah, because the mind, contrary to kind of false logic, the mind doesn't function the best when it's under stress and anxiety. And I've been reading a lot about some of these other techniques that are being developed through flow science and positive psychology, and these techniques that extreme athletes and Navy SEALs and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies they're developing, that very much mimics kind of the traditional religious life of having these worship, awe-inspired, altered states of consciousness, states on the weekends, or in between the stressful times, right? And they've realized that that allows them to perform much better and be on their game much better, if they don't do that and they're just always trying focused on the work.
Yeah, and I guess relative to that, there may be various kinds of realities or aspects of reality that we can be in awe of. But it stands to reason. It seems reasonable to suppose that of all these various kinds of laws, there's scientific laws, the billions of stars in the universe and stuff, that I think that the most awesome is God, because God is all these other, awesome things combined. And again, like maybe now there has to be, I think, well, it's interesting because like in Buddhism, I was going to say there's a tradition of meditating on God, but Buddhism doesn't believe in God, so you got to wonder. But I wonder if there is a tradition anywhere where they just like sit, for day after day after day, just contemplating God. Because if there isn't, there probably should be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more in Hinduism. They've got a little bit more reputation for living in caves for 10 and 20 years doing this. Um, you know, uh, and Christian mysticism, I think, and monasticism as well. Um, so I mean, I think there's two approaches for it, and whether you do it just for a week or you commit to that lifestyle. I think what's really needed more is community support for all these techniques and versions of God that allows for drawing from all of the many different modalities that the many different religions have came up with over the years. Even if it's other activities that alter consciousness. And so we're about out of time, but we'll continue to talk about these new ideas of God and these new ways to relate to God in future episodes. So tune back in and we'll have more to say about that.